Hi, and welcome to our first module in Management 519. So as the class suggests, as the class title suggests, technology commercialization will be kind of the main focus of our 8-week class. The basic definition that we will go with, there's plenty of definitions you can find on the internet, but this is the one I think that fits kind of our interests and the goals of this class the best, which is commercialization is the process through which knowledge, discoveries, and inventions are converted into new or significantly improved products and services that create economic value and satisfy customers' needs. That's a pretty spot-on definition for technology commercialization. Again, some of you might have previous experience in this, and that's beneficial. Stick with me in the first couple of modules where we're going to go through some of the basics of technology and innovation. And after that, we will kind of move forward and be more specific in the technology commercialization space. So there's several different paths. Typically, some of you might have already pursued these. You can be an individual or a team of people, and you have an idea for a technology, and you want to, build a company around that. You might be a university researcher who once has been doing a lot of research or some basic research, and you've decided, hey, I think there are some commercial applications here. And of course, the classic case where small or large corporations essentially develop new technologies and bring them to the market, right? So the core is here. We're looking at new technologies, new inventions, and want to kind of see the potential for these technologies. If we're looking at it a bit more from a bird's perspective, what we'll see is that there's obviously a variety of layers about technology to commercialization, right? There is the actor layer. We just talked about the firms, the entrepreneurs, the university researchers. There is a technology layer, right? So what kind of technology are you developing? Is this a more radical new technology? Is this something more incremental? There is the market layer, right? So whether it's your customers, that could be businesses or individual consumers. And now what we've also seen come up more and more is the ecosystem layer that also includes these big platform ecosystems, as well as alliances, collaborations, networks, industry, etc., of which we're going to talk about a little later. And this is kind of a broad kind of idea of what we're going to talk about. We're going to start with technology and innovation, discuss some of the basics in these two areas. And then we're going to build the contextual areas around it, which is the corporate context, the academic context, the entrepreneurial, the institutional, environmental, and societal. And we're going to emerge to get a comprehensive view of technology commercialization. Now, there's going to be a couple of definitions and conceptualizations. First and foremost, technology. Then we're going to talk about innovation, and then we also have to keep the difference between invention and innovation in mind. As the class progresses, we're going to be coming back to these definitions and these phrases and conceptualizations. But on a most basic level, technology is a collection of techniques, skills, methods, and processes used in the production of goods or services or in the accomplishment of objectives, such as scientific inquiry. In a little bit, I'm going to talk I'm going to talk about the history of innovation, the history of technology. I'm sorry, and then in our second module, we're going to talk more about innovation. We're going to focus more on that, and eventually we're going to kind of discuss kind of where these technologies and where these innovations come from, and often historically they come from individuals or entities inventing, so to speak, new products, services, etc., etc. So let's start with a brief history of technology. I don't know if you're familiar with all these time frames in human history. I am not, I had to read up some of these things as well. But there is something called the Paleolithic age, which is approximately from 500,000 BC to 10,000 BC or BCE. Okay, so you can use the denomination as well. And most of us have probably seen some movies, where we have Neanderthals and dinosaurs and, all these kind of entities together. But here, from a technology point of view, most of us, what has been developed were stone tools, right? And if we go back to our initial definition here of technology, collection of techniques, skills, methods, and processes, this is what humans are starting to develop, right? So as human history starts to commence, the production of tools will become pretty central in our development. And as I said, so stone is kind of the main production material. Fire, right? So we discover fire by some accident, essentially, and then use it strategically to kind of warm ourselves and adjust to the environmental conditions, and that helps us essentially grow as a species. Then we have the Mesolithic age, and again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is just a really brief run through, but just kind of helps us understand how our relationship with technology evolves, right? And so as we're able to use more and more materials, right, whether that's leather, whether that's stone, whether that's bronze in a little bit, whether that's clothing, right? So we develop these materials to kind of help us stay warm, help us hunt, help us provide food, clothing, etc., etc. These kind of basic human needs that help us survive in this relatively hostile early part of our history. Again, we then kind of move to agriculture, and as you later see, we move into industrial production, so we kind of develop our tools further and further, right? We also cooperate more as humans develop or become more territorial or expand in the territory. We also do a lot more trading, right? So we can essentially get materials from other places in the world, and we can then use those materials to develop new techniques or innovations. And again, so most of these things, of course, a big part of technology development will end up being weapons, right? So whether that's swords, whether that's bows, whether that's spears. So this is becoming kind of a specialized part of technology development, is weapons. So then we kind of start developing kind of more advanced materials, especially alloys. Okay, so we're going from bronze to metal alloys, but we also start doing a lot more arts and entertainment, right? So we started using our production facilities to do that. Yeah, Middle Ages were a turbulent period in Europe. However, in other geographical areas, we've seen some major developments technologically and infrastructurally. We see later on, as these things move forward, that we've seen a lot of trade between China and Europe and Asia. So we'll see a lot of technology development here. Most of what we kind of see is kind of horse harnesses, plows, mechanical clocks, ships, right? Ships become very important, especially in the time after the Middle Ages, where international trade is starting to become very dominant and very important. Also has, of course, some a lot of negative effects. We've seen especially European countries engage in colonization, aggressive acquisition of territory, trying to take advantage of resources, whether that's gold, wood, or other materials. And so we see kind of the emergence of massive extractive economies that later will kind of move into or kind of convert into more capitalistic and technology-driven economies. Here, from roughly 1750 to 1950, there is quite a few things happening, right? We have the foundation of the US in the creation of the US as an autonomous territory in 1776. But we also have the emergence of intellectual property systems. Technologically, we see, especially in the weapons area, a massive development in the next 200 years. We have 2 world wars, and kind of the main outcome of this time is essentially the industrialization and the ability to mass produce goods such as cars, fridges, etc., as we'll see later. And most of us pretty familiar with the information age. Starts about post-World War II and kind of the development of the computer and the development of the transistor is essentially enabling all our modern technological devices, whether it's laptops, smartphones, etc. And, you know, some of the key points, you know, we've seen, we kind of crossed a pretty large period, right? 500,000 BCE to today. And so what we've seen is that technological development has been mostly evolutionary, right? So we made some bigger jumps, right? Especially in the last couple of hundred years, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. We kind of see some stats on that. But mostly, right, we progress from tools using different materials and kind of keep developing until we, in addition to kind of social, political, cultural, and environmental and economic landscapes, these multiple forces kind of shape how technology is used and utilized in different periods and different circumstances. This is from a paper by David Ahlstrom, and he tried to make an empirical link between economic growth, technology, and innovation. And what he tried to demonstrate is that there's a very strong link between that, right? So we know that the GDP growth in the US or in kind of developed economies has seen some impressive performance in the last, we'd say, 150 years. We see even small growth rates, right? So a 1.8% annual growth rate can generate through the compound interest, can actually lead some major gains. We've seen that this growth has also led to poverty reduction, right? And often papers and research is looking at that $1 a day metric. And we've seen that in the last, I'd say, 30 years, we've seen a major reduction in people living on this $1 a day. And technological innovation, another big impact here, another big insight here, is one of the key drivers of economic growth. Okay. And he demonstrates that, so, you know, the data in GDP per capita, of course, they took some samples, you know, we only have kind of rudimentary knowledge and estimates how much the GDP was 1,000 years ago. But when we look at the last 150 years, we've seen a major jump in GDP per capita, right? And this is essentially parallel to what we've seen in terms of technology development, right? Cars, steam engines, airplanes, infrastructure, computers, et cetera, right? We have a lot of scalable technologies that have been developed in the last 10 to 20 years. And so these have really led to some massive growth rates. Okay, and here just some context about inventions during that time, right? So when we look at the last 150 years here, what has been invented? Electric batteries, bicycles, generators, telephones, X-ray machines, right? So even in health, we've seen a lot of new applications. We have a lot of household items like electric vacuum cleaners. We have the internet, also called the ARPANET, first developed by the military, by the US military to communicate with each other. And we've seen since massive growth in internet applications, et cetera, right? So we've seen some major development here. And of course, also as per the usual, a lot of weapons, nuclear bombs, stealth bombers, et cetera. The ability, right? The technology gives us the ability to scale our operations, whether that's weapons, whether that's cars, whether that's health, right? Any of these areas, technology is a major driver to scale impact for better or for worse. And these are some innovations we've seen in the last 25 years. The Prius, digital cameras, video games, et cetera. It obviously has social implications, right? We alluded to that in our brief history discussion. Big tech, right? We hear a lot about big tech and how their platforms are dominating the economy, right? Whether that's Amazon's platform, whether that's Google, whether that's Facebook, right? All these big tech companies have reached a size and an impact that tests some of our institutional protections around that, right? We've just seen oil prices and the OPEC in big debates with the US government, big discussion with the US government. Fracking, some of you might be familiar with that. That has been developed a couple of decades ago. The ability to essentially extract oil and gas from areas that were previously economically not viable, right? And so that has created kind of a whole new industry in the US where, you know, oil extraction had been dead 20, 30 years ago and led to a new boom, but also a lot of costs, right? So there's obviously some environmental costs in fracking, and therefore also a lot of resistance to implement that. All of us are aware of social media. Some of these have very positive factors, right? Communication, instant communication, the ability to interact with people online, the ability to exchange information online, share things online, but has also a lot of negative effects, right? And we kind of, since this is a relatively new technology, right? So social media, this is what exists maybe 10, 15 years now. We are kind of still dealing with that, right? So what should we do with social media? How should we regulate? What are the consequences of overuse, et cetera, And of course, for our class, we have to think about what are kind of the commercialization opportunities here, right? And whether that's social media, whether that's cars, whether that's airplanes, et cetera. New technologies are kind of making an impact, and understanding how we can what kind of economic, social, environmental value we can extract or we can create with technologies, right? It's not only about money. a lot of people want to develop technologies to help people, right? And so if we look at these metrics, we have to really think about how do new technologies kind of impact these areas. We know, all of us probably have used Netflix or Amazon Prime in some form or shape. Continuing to what we discussed previously with social media, there is a whole new world, right? In the last 10, 15 years, enabled by the internet, we've seen a massive, a lot of massive disruption events, right? Blockbuster goes out of business. The emergence of electric cars, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We can pay, we have these mobile payments, and we have smartphones that can essentially do pretty much anything, right? They can take pictures, they can run calculations, we can use apps, right? This enabling app ecosystem has really disrupted a lot of industries. A lot of camera makers had to scale down their operations or had to go out of business because turns out, well, those cameras on those smartphones are really good, right? And that's a big differentiator between some of them, or one of the differentiating factors between Google Pixel, Apple, and Samsung is how do we kind of compete with these different technological features that we offer. Obviously, we've all been through COVID-19 in the last 3 years. We do this, the emergence of online classes, asynchronous or synchronous, that we've seen these kind of external events create these disruptions. So COVID really helped develop all these communication and teleworking arrangement or tele-education arrangements. So we see that external events or external shocks, technology is really good handling them, right? So they adjusting to these external shocks, technology can help us do this really well. An important concept, and we'll talk more about these kind of concepts as we go forward, is called an S-curve, okay? And what that means, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a little bit, is that as we introduce a new technology, we also have to check, we have to see how it's diffused in the marketplace, like how is it accepted in the marketplace. And so an S-curve is essentially demonstrating that, right? Is an indicator of how these technologies are moving in the marketplace. You can imagine, right, when we first introduced the car, for example, that was in the 1900s, the performance of the car was relatively limited, right? But as that technology moves forward, we typically we're seeing a performance enhancement. And as we see a performance enhancement, we also have a higher rate of adoption, right? So as things become better, as things become faster, cheaper, etc., more and more people adopt that technology, right? And so in that phase, in that early phase, that's really critical to understand who will adopt and use that technology and what kind of impact will it have on. So typically, if we want to look at this from a economic value perspective, right, at the beginning of the technology development, companies or entities typically don't make a lot of money, right? Because you have to spend a lot of money developing, you have to pay your engineers, your materials, you have to test a lot, experiment a lot. Typically, right, as you pass a certain time point, that's when you make a lot of profit, right? So now, for example, when the iPhone was first introduced, I think it was 2007 or 2008, Apple had to eat a lot of development costs, right? They had to build a lot of infrastructure. They had to, spend a lot of upfront money to actually have this ready. But as we've seen now, right, over the last 10, 15 years, every successive iPhone model is essentially an incremental step on top of the other, right? So they're capable of reusing some of the components. They have to redesign some others, but they're effectively in this high profit well, when we call it maturity range, but definitely in the high profit range in Apple's case. And typically, that's not always the case, right? We've seen that with digital products, this kind of cost curve is not necessarily really working that way. But if we take cars, for example, right? So in the beginning, developing and producing cars was expensive because we didn't have a big market. But as the market increases, our learning curve and our cost benefits and our ability to essentially scale at a cheaper price becomes more pronounced, right? And so what we've seen is essentially that whether it's electronics or cars or other mass-produced items, as time goes by, right, as more people adopt that technology or as the market grows, we have a lower cost of that product. And as that product reduces in cost, we'll get more and more people adopting it, right? So there's a dependence, there's a causal mechanism involved in this. And these are some examples of technology S-curves, right? So when the kind of adoption rates, and you can see, for example, that should be, let's take electricity, right? Was introduced in the early 1900s. It took about, let me see, roughly 25 years to get to a 65% adoption rate, right? And in electricity's case, you have a bunch of factors, but one important is the infrastructure, right? So, and that was expensive for the electricity or the power companies to build the power lines and to get all this done, right? Especially in the US, where there's kind of we have the middle part of the country that's not very populated, but we have the kind of the both coasts that are very populated. Bridging that geographical distance took quite a while. Refrigerators, okay, they were introduced, let me see, I want to say 20 something, okay, so early 1920s, and we got a nearly, well, a de facto 100% adoption in about, I want to say 30 years approximately. Okay, so 30 years took for everybody to get a refrigerator. They are much shorter when we look at computers. Okay, so computer adoption rates were relatively quick. The internet, we still, some places are struggling more than others. Air conditioning, color TV, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've seen is essentially as we move towards the 21st century, our adoption curves get a lot shorter, right? It takes a lot less time to get mass adoption for products and services. And we talked a little bit about transistors. Okay, so here's kind of an example of a technology model, right? So the kind of metric to see how we're doing technologically is the number of transistors per microprocessor. And there's something called Moore's law, and which essentially means that technological developments are growing exponentially. Not only because we're getting smarter, that's relative, but we have a lot of supporting structure. And so the more innovations we bring to the market, the more cross-pollination we have. But in the microprocessor case, what we've seen is just the number of transistors expands. And what that means is we have more processing power. And with more processing power, we can do more things. And as we can do more things, we can go back and add more transistors to the microprocessor. There is something called, this is kind of a idealization of how technology gets adopted, right? And this is kind of how we characterize certain customer groups or certain adopter groups. We will talk about the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. So when you launch a new technology, right, you have to really think about who are the innovators, right? Who are the early adopters that you can target? They can give you enough information. They can test your device, use your device, so that you can take that information and keep developing and growing your customer base. And this is another technology model, right? It's called technology acceptance model. And the idea is, well, how do I actually, right, for companies, what kind of behaviors and attitudes do my prospective customers have, or which of these would I have to change in order to get my technology adopted, right? That's actually a pretty critical question. A lot of the unsuccessful technologies fail to be able to get people to adopt them, right? Because they ignore their behaviors, they ignore the attitudes, they ignore their preferences, right? And because of that, they fail to kind of cross this adoption curve, right? They'll never get adopted by early majority and late majority and laggards, because they're not capable of figuring out, or they won't be, or they run out of money to figure out how customers kind of like to use that technology. And as kind of as a summary for this, so we've seen that adoption is initially slow, right? And also depends a little bit on the product and service you're launching, right? If you launch a new car, that takes a little longer than if you launch a new app, right? Because apps can be adopted pretty quickly. As people understand the utility of the technology, these S-curves accelerate, right? That's kind of the critical part that you have to bridge. Then as your technology kind of saturates, right, as there's a certain amount of users, you'll have to increasingly compete with other technologies, right, or other apps, or, you know, in whatever sector you're in, you have to deal with this. And it takes a long time, it takes a lot longer to diffuse technologies than knowledge, information diffusion, right? And so sometimes you don't have the complementary assets, and we'll talk about these in the next couple of modules, but you don't have the supporting technologies needed, right? The infrastructure needed to kind of launch, to kind of make your technology successful. Think about the fact that if Apple had tried to launch the smartphone 20 years, like in the 90s, they might have had problems because the internet was not developed enough. App development was not there yet. They would have failed with a concept that 10, 20 years later was a huge success, right? So I'm thinking about where and how you launch your technology. Is there enough of a knowledge base? Are there enough supporting technologies or innovations that will help you do that? Is very critical. Okay, and lastly, right, so what we call a discontinuous technology, right, and we'll also talk about that in the context of competence enhancing and competence destroying innovations. Sometimes you need a complete new knowledge base, right? So when you switch from carbon copying to photocopying, or vinyl records to compact discs, that's a huge jump, right? It's not an incremental innovation anymore. And so even though you fulfill a similar market, right? I mean, you target people who like to listen to music. The music listening technologies that will come to the market might be really different from each other, right? And so this discontinuity, so let's say similar to when you use a calculator, right? You remember these old hand calculators that you had. Now we can do this on the app, right? Now we can do this on the smartphone. As we talked before, the smartphone kind of eliminated a lot of these kind of supplementary devices. And so whenever you have this discontinuity, you have to be really aware of what that means in terms of the strategy and the impact it has on the market. And so if we think about companies, right? So we talked a little bit about society, we talked about history, we kind of alluded to some of these things. But if we think about a firm perspective, right? Like if we're in a business school and we're looking at businesses, what do they need to consider when they're engaging in technology and innovation, right? First is every company has a internal process or capability, right? Do new technologies that I develop or that I can use from other people help me improve my operations, my manufacturing, my employee management, etc., right? Does it make me a better company? Can it help me establish new, better, more complex, different connections with my customers, right? So social media, right, is a classic way of how I can directly engage with my customers. Sometimes that goes well, sometimes that doesn't go well. But there is like email, right? Email is a massive innovation, right? What did we actually do before email? How did we communicate, right? We called each other, we sent each other letters. Email has increased kind of productivity and communication style significantly. And then using technology, can we also develop new technology of our own, right? Does it enable us, let's say, new software or new programming software? Does it help me improve my apps, right? Things like that. Examples, Walmart, Apple, right? So Apple needs to respond to Samsung and Google, right? So how do they improve their technologies? Walmart, they had to rebuild their infrastructure a little bit, adopt the infrastructure to COVID-19, right? That was one of the advantages that Amazon had. They've been online for essentially their entire the entire foundation of the company. Walmart had to adjust, right? Walmart was still operating a lot of physical locations, and during COVID-19, because of the restrictions and other things, they had to build a completely new digital infrastructure for them in order to be able to compete. And so more broadly, right? So we are in competition, right? So that means we always companies are always subject to price pressures. I can alleviate those if I have better technology. I can reach out to more customers, improve my pricing, etc., etc. Right? At the same time, when I think about, okay, so how do I rebuild my company, right? How do I restructure my company in terms of technology? Should I acquire technology? Should I develop technology? I need to kind of think about, how does technology change, right? If I'm a huge company like Walmart, I have to realize, how does technology change, right? What new technologies do I need to consider for my operations in order to be competitive? And when we think about developing technology, and we'll talk about that more in the next couple of modules, the typical view, right? So we talked a little bit when we talked about history of technology. The typical way of how new technologies came into the market was essentially science, right? University, scientific discovery. Today, this view looks a little different, and I'll show you in a minute. But yeah, in the 1900s, post World War II, you still had a lot of companies running labs, right? They had these research labs like Bell Labs, General Electric had a lot of labs before they kind of changed the way of how they innovate and how they bring technologies to the market. But that's how universities partly still do things, right? So as a society, we have universities who do all this basic research, and then people look at this basic research and essentially start constructing, whether it's technologies, innovations, tools, etc. And eventually we end up at this point, right? So this is kind of the traditional linear view of how new technologies come to pass. When we think about this from a organizational perspective, it's a little more complicated, right? So whether you're a large organization, you have different processes, structures, routines that help you kind of innovate or hamper you from innovating. If you're a smaller company that doesn't have a lot of routines or doesn't have a lot of bureaucracy, it's a lot easier for you to innovate and bring new products to the market. but you don't have the financial, let's say, muscle that big companies have to spend time on innovation and technology. Boeing, okay, there is a YouTube video. You're welcome. They will do a demonstration of how Boeing produces their planes. Yeah, that's a pretty cool company. You know, based in the 1920s, 30s, they started with wooden planes, and then World War II and post World War II, they built these two different branches, right? The military branch that produces military fighter jets, and then they have the civil branch that produces Boeings for people to kind of fly throughout the US and the world. They had a huge scandal. I don't know if you remember or you read about the 737. That was a problem, right? They implemented a new technological system that they didn't properly, that management didn't properly understand the consequences. We've seen some planes come down, and so then they had to talk with regulators. They lost a lot of money on the stock. The value on the stock market dropped. A lot of airline companies essentially canceled their orders. And so it's super important to understand when you develop a new technology and you implement it, what consequences will that have along the line. Multiplier effects, we alluded to that, right? But the need for you to, we just don't always understand, right, what new technologies can bring to pass and how they can interact with other technologies, right? When they first developed the computer in the 40s and 50s, they didn't think about the internet, right? But then when the internet came along, suddenly we realized the internet plus other things also leads to other new unprecedented innovations, right? Again, somebody in the 40s would have never predicted Facebook in 60, 70 years from now, right? But the computer is a base foundational technology for social media to work, right? For social media to be launched, for smaller devices to be implemented into the marketplace, etc. So we never really fully understand what the multiplier effects are, and the people who have a better understanding of that, they always do really well in launching their technologies. This is a good example. Everybody knows about Tesla. Elon Musk didn't create the first Tesla cars. That was actually Martin Eberhard and Mark Tappening. They kind of founded the company with Elon Musk's help, but he wasn't as active in the beginning. As they started kind of building some market traction, right? They started with roadsters. So a pretty common strategy that you see is that you target a customer group that has a lot of disposable income, right? That way, that group can kind of help you develop your products. You're a lot more, they're not as price sensitive, right? So you have more space and more time to experiment, which is what they did with the Roadster, right? They used an electric powertrain. They essentially rebuilt the entire car, and slowly but surely, so keep in mind, so this was founded in 2013, 2015, Tesla was still a $3.2 billion company. And I'll show you the stats and the market valuation, today's dollars. But slowly but surely, right, they built essentially that Tesla brand, starting with that electric powertrain system, right? And today's Tesla is a lot more than just an electric car, right? It's essentially a driving computer. And that's what we will probably see in the future, is that cars become these driving computers, and whoever has access to that market will pretty much dominate the industry, which is why Apple and Google are also so interested in the car industry, right? They don't care much to produce cars, but they care to have their operating system, their apps, all their digital infrastructure accessible for the customer in those cars. And so just as kind of a brief provision of metrics, Tesla is, I think it was, these are 22. I'll have to double check if this was this year or last year, but Tesla is worth as much as all the other major car manufacturers together, worth on the stock market, right? And we know this kind of changes a little bit, but it's incredible, right? So when you look at revenues, right, the revenue, Tesla's revenues are much lower than other car manufacturers' revenues. Their net income is very good, but the evaluation, right, which means what people expect from the future, they are valuing Tesla a lot higher. Is not officially yet considered a big tech company, but has the chance to become a big tech company, essentially converting the car into their driving smartphone, so to speak. And that's it for this module. I hope you enjoy it. Feel free to send me any questions along the way. You can always contact me via email, or I have office hours Wednesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. And yeah, enjoy and talk soon.